One of my earliest Halloween episodes dealt with Chicago cemeteries, grave robbers, mob killings, and even Liz Taylor. I've gone back and expanded and re-recorded that episode talking about Chicago's ghoulish past, here for you to enjoy today. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Before we get started, I should mention this episode deals with death and bodies and murder and other creepy stuff. While not explicit, it is probably not recommended listening for delicate ears. One of the first cemeteries in Chicago was located at what is now Chicago Avenue and North State Street in the late 1830s. At the time, this area was considered quite remote, a perfect resting place for those who passed on. But as the growing city started to push north, city officials began to look for alternate sites. The wooded area just north of North Avenue and east of Green Bay Road, later renamed Clark Street, was deemed ideal for Chicago's new city cemetery. In December 1842, land for the new city cemetery was set aside by ordinance, and interments began the following year. From 1843 until its last burial in 1866, the area from North Avenue to the south to Wisconsin Street to the north became the final resting place for tens of thousands of departed souls. By the way, I'm saying final in quotes. There was also a smaller Catholic cemetery south of North Avenue, and a Jewish burial society bought 6/7 of an acre in the city cemetery in 1846. The late 1840s saw a cholera epidemic affect much of the world, including Chicago. The local medical community was ill-equipped to battle this bacterial infection spread by means of contaminated food, water, and sewage. In 1849, cholera killed approximately 678 people in Chicago, about 2.9% of the city's population at the time, which was roughly 23,000 residents. That means roughly 1 in every 35 Chicagoans died from cholera during that summer, often within 24 hours of showing symptoms. As Chicago's north side had more than its share of cholera infections, residents began to suspect the city cemetery might be contributing to the problem. Although the water table in the city cemetery was fairly high, most coffins were buried at least 5 feet deep, resulting in 3/4 of the grave sites filling with water even before bodies were interred. The area's natural topography sent rainfall to lower ground, which meant before that water drained into Lake Michigan, the city's primary drinking water source, it seeped through the soil that contained the decomposing bodies of cholera victims. Here's where we can take a moment to go, ew. I should point out that it wasn't just concerns about the water that had residents up in arms. According to newspapers of the day, as many of the bodies were not well buried, there was also a putrefying stench in the area. 5 years later, in 1854, cholera reared its ugly head once again, only this time with far deadlier consequences. Estimates claim there were between 1,400 to 1,500 deaths that year, roughly 5% of the city's 30,000 residents at the time, or 1 out of every 20. Dr. John Henry Rausch came to Chicago in 1857 to be a professor at Rush Medical College. Beginning in the fall of 1858, Rausch began a campaign to bring awareness to the health hazards posed by the city cemetery, reinforced with a petition to Chicago's Common Council signed by prominent citizens who resided on the north side. That November, the Common Council appointed a special commission to study the cemetery, and in fewer than 3 months, the commission recommended to the Common Council that burials in the city cemetery be halted. Future burials would be sent to, quote, rural cemeteries, such as Rose Hill and Graceland Cemetery to the north, and Oakwood Cemetery on the city's south side. Continued concerns about tainted drinking water brought about an 1859 ordinance that was enacted to stop the sales of new family lots in the city cemetery. Unfortunately, this did not prohibit burials in established lots or in the potter's field in the southeast part of the cemetery, the area closest to the waterline back then. During the Civil War, John Rausch, the doctor who first set off the alarms about the city cemetery, served as assistant medical director of the Union Army of Virginia. Upon returning to Chicago after the war, he discovered burials had continued at the city cemetery. According to Rausch's research, there were 11,341 interments from January 1860 through March of 1866, plus an additional 3,871 Confederate prisoners of war who died while at Camp Douglas on the city's south side, for a total of 15,212 bodies buried after the ordinance. There were concerns that many more burials may not have been properly documented. Oh, almost forgot. In 1860, in response to growing public health concerns and the need for open spaces, 60 acres of unused land to the north of the city cemetery was reserved as Lake Park. It would be renamed Lincoln Park just 2 days after Abraham Lincoln's death in April 1865 to honor the fallen president. I'm going to sidestep one ghoulish story for a moment to talk about another, albeit related, ghoulish story. While many early grave robbers called resurrectionists back then sought jewelry and anything of value within an unearthed casket, in the mid-1800s there were also grave robbers who sought the corpses themselves, which could be sold to medical colleges for anatomical study. Grave robbers even included students from Rush Medical College here in Chicago, now known as Rush University, as there was a shortage of legally available bodies for anatomical study. Then came the arrest of Chicago's city sexton, Martin Quinlan. In the mid-1800s, the city sexton was the official gravedigger responsible for preparing graves and overseeing burials within the city cemetery grounds. The sexton supervised the upkeep of the cemetery, ensuring that the grounds, carriageways, and alleys were kept in good order. The sexton could request improvements or repairs, but most expenditures required approval from the Common Council. The sexton also assisted with the sale of burial plots. Prospective buyers would apply to the sexton, and upon payment, the city would issue a deed for the lot. The sexton maintained records of unsold lots and facilitated transactions. When cemeteries were closed or relocated, the sexton was often charged with exhuming bodies and overseeing the reburial in new locations. Now, if some of you are thinking this position would be ripe for corruption, you've got a pretty good idea about how Chicago works. In October 1857, the graves of 4 recently buried individuals were found empty just days after interment, and the city's aldermen, suspecting inside involvement, turned to the Pinkerton Detective Agency rather than the local police, likely due to Martin Quinlan's law enforcement connections as city sexton. Pinkerton detectives set up surveillance and eventually caught Quinlan in the act. They observed a buggy carrying the scent of corpses, and when they moved in to arrest those involved, Quinlan was found fixing the harness. He was immediately recognized by the detectives, and after a brief chase, during which 2 other suspects escaped, Quinlan was taken into custody. 2 bodies, packed in canvas bags, were found in the buggy. Quinlan was held for trial and ultimately convicted of conspiring with medical students to steal cadavers. In 1864, the Chicago City Council formally ordered the removal of bodies from the city cemetery to new rural cemeteries outside the city limits, marking the beginning of what became known as the Great Removal. This would be no small undertaking, no pun intended. At the height of its use, there were an estimated 35,000 persons buried in the area, including the Potter's Field for the poor and unclaimed, and as many as 4,000 deceased Civil War Confederate POW soldiers from Chicago's Camp Douglas at 33rd and Cottage Grove on the south side. Bodies were carted to Graceland, Oakwoods, Rose Hill, and Wonders cemeteries. Many of the Catholic dead were reburied at Calvary in Evanston and St. Boniface in Chicago. Jews had moved their burial ground to a 4-acre section on the southwest corner of Belmont and Clark in 1856, which would also later be relocated due to the expanding city. Side note, remember that first city cemetery I mentioned located at Chicago Avenue and North State Street? On Saturday, December 3rd, 1864, 16 years after those bodies were allegedly disinterred and moved to the city cemetery, workers putting in sewer lines in that original area found, quote, a half-score of coffins. I had to look it up, it means 10, which then had to be moved to the city cemetery. Things took an unexpected turn after 1866 when a legal dispute over a 12-acre section of the city cemetery called the Milliman Tract resulted in a court order to return the land to its heirs. The city began relocating remains from this tract to other cemeteries between 1866 and 1868. Wider cemetery disinterments occurred between 1866 and 1872 as Lincoln Park was established and expanded. The Lincoln Park Commissioners took over the land in 1869, with further removals taking place in the early 1870s. Then came the Great Chicago Fire in October 1871. As that fire progressed north, residents eager to escape the flames hurriedly ran through the cemetery grounds, knocking over markers and gravestones as they headed toward the lake. When the fire reached the area, it destroyed many graveyard features, including wooden crosses and marble markers, leaving graves unmarked, making it difficult to account for the remains below. The fire also ravaged the cemetery grounds, burning down large wooden monuments and shattering stone vaults, exposing the corpses within. Chicago writer, artist, and educator Pamela Bannos has done some amazing research on the city cemetery in her project Hidden Truths, available online and a great resource for this episode. I'll have a link to it in the show's notes if you want to dig deeper on this subject. Bannos estimates that of the 35,000 buried in the park, no more than 22,500 bodies were relocated. That leaves more than 12,000 unaccounted for. If you're waiting for me to say they were eventually moved, that does not appear to be the case. In case you didn't listen to the Lincoln Park Statues and Monuments episode, there is still one notable sign of Lincoln Park Cemetery past: the Couch Tomb, which is situated in the curve of Lakeshore Drive behind the Chicago History Museum. Ira Couch and his brother James operated the city's first grand hotel, the Tremont, which was quite successful as the city grew, making the Couch family quite wealthy. When Ira Couch died suddenly at the age of 50 during a winter stay in Cuba, his family had the one-story mausoleum built from a design by John M. Van Osdel, considered this city's first architect. The cost to build the 13-foot-high, 50-ton mausoleum was $7,000, roughly $260,000 in today's value. The tomb was never moved, likely because of its weight, the cost of such an undertaking, or due to a gentleman's agreement with the Lincoln Park District Board. The tomb was restored in 1999 to honor the park's past. The cemetery just south of the Chicago City Cemetery, the one for Catholics, was bounded on the north by North Avenue, to the east by what is now Astor Street, to the south at Schiller, and to the west Dearborn Street. In the mid-1870s, plans were made to disinter those graves as well, to create residential homes. One newspaper article I found included some pretty horrific details of hastily removed caskets, empty holes in the ground, and limbs left behind. One article claimed, quote, "It is not an uncommon sight, that of children marching off with the pale reminiscence of a defunct limb, and not long ago 2 youths engaged in combat, each armed with the relic of an arm." That land would become home to multi-million-dollar mansions owned by people like Potter Palmer and the Archbishop. It is now part of Chicago's fabled Gold Coast. Something to keep in mind, in the nearly 150 years since the Catholic cemetery was allegedly cleared of its former occupants, There have been numerous reports of skeletal remains being unearthed during construction in the area. Those years? 1900, 1947, 1971, 2004, 2006, 2008, and even as recently as 2010. The next time you're jogging, biking, playing baseball, or just having a picnic in Lincoln Park, you may just be standing mere feet above the forgotten dead. Let's talk more about grave robbing, shall we? In addition to grave robbers who sought anything of value within a casket or to steal the bodies to sell for other purposes, there have been those who rob graves for other money-making efforts. Over the years, grave robbers have also sought to dig up corpses to then hold them for ransom. One of the more notable examples of this was in 1978 in Switzerland, when famed actor Charlie Chaplin's corpse was stolen and a ransom demand was made of his widow Una of $600,000. Una refused to pay the ransom, saying that her husband would have considered the demand ridiculous. 5 weeks later, police arrested 2 out-of-work auto mechanics who led the authorities to Chaplin's body, which was then reburied in a concrete grave to prevent future theft attempts. Now, if you're wondering the Chicago connection, there really isn't a big one, just thought it was interesting, although Chaplin did spend a few months making movies here in the early 1900s. A little closer to home, not even Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, was immune to an attempted grave robbery. Lincoln was buried shortly after his death in 1865 and remained undisturbed for 11 years when, on election night 1876, a group of Chicago counterfeiters turned grave robbers traveled to Springfield in an attempt to steal Lincoln's body. Their goal was money and a pardon for a jailed pal, all which went horribly wrong for them. Back then, Lincoln's body was housed within an above-ground white marble sarcophagus in a tomb on the grounds of Springfield, Illinois' Oak Ridge Cemetery, located about 2 miles outside of town. No groundskeeper lived there, and no night watchman patrolled the area around the president's tomb. Keeping out any ne'er-do-wells was a single padlock on the tomb's chamber door. Once past that padlock, one was not faced with getting through many feet of concrete to get to the body. The lid of the sarcophagus was sealed with the much less permanent plaster of Paris. Great for making sculptures, not so great for keeping out bad guys. After hiring someone they thought was a professional grave robber who was actually a Secret Service agent, the counterfeiters' plan unraveled quickly. They did not get access to Lincoln's body and were later arrested. Lincoln's body was soon hidden away in the basement of the nearby memorial building. It was later moved a few more times, all in secret, before finding its final resting place in the monument tomb in a 10-foot deep vault under tons of concrete. In June of 1932, at Mount Carmel Cemetery, just west of Chicago city limits in Hillside, Illinois, a gunfight broke out near the grave of a recently buried gangster. Al Capone was serving 11 years for income tax evasion, and George Red Barker, a teamster who by most accounts aspired to take over for Capone, was gunned down just after midnight on June 17th of that year after exiting a car just south of the corner of what is now Pulaski and North Avenue while walking with 2 men and 1 woman. Somehow none of the others with Barker were hit by the volley of bullets. Although witnesses claimed to see a car speeding off after the shots, police found a discarded machine gun and bullet casings in a room on the 2nd floor of the building at 1502 North Crawford. That street was renamed Pulaski the following year. Clinging to life, Barker was carried by his associates 2 doors down to the Norford Hotel, still in operation as of this writing. Said to be the headquarters of Marty Guilfoyle, the head gangster in that area who Barker was planning to visit. Barker was then brought in to the Keystone Hospital at 1623 North Costner, long gone, where they were greeted by locked doors. Kicking in the door to the hospital, one of them reportedly shouted to the nurse, "Take care of this man. Money's no object." The nurse helped carry Barker to a bed and informed the associates there was no hope of saving him, at which point the associates took off. The head of the Keystone Hospital notified Barker's brother of the killing, and Barker's brother, Dr. J. Gould Barker of the Martha Washington Hospital at Irving and Western, went to the Keystone Hospital to assist in the post-mortem exam of his brother's body. One report claimed 18 bullets were pulled from George Barker. Another claimed 36 bullets. Either way, that's a lot of bullets. Back to that gravesite shootout. Shortly after midnight on Wednesday, June 22nd, Mount Carmel Cemetery caretaker Joseph Sobel, age 50, was driving to Section 26 in the southwest corner of the cemetery when he saw a group of men standing over a gravesite, throwing flowers to the side. Calling out, "What are you doing?" Sobel was greeted with a half-dozen gunshots. He was able to get behind his vehicle and, because Chicago, drew his own pistol and fired 2 or 3 shots in response before his gun jammed. The hoodlums, as they were referred to in the Tribune story, continued firing, puncturing the hood of Sobel's car, his windshield, and both his front tires. The caretaker ran back to his office and notified the watchman, who then notified Bellwood police. The Bellwood police were unable to find the hoodlums. Police initially thought the thieves may have been there to steal back the elaborate wire cages for the floral displays at the well-adorned funeral. Baker's funeral had nearly 400 of them. One report claims there were 18 full cars that carried flowers to the gravesite, including a 10-foot cross made of roses. But then police discarded that theory and focused on whether Barker may have been buried with valuables and important documents in his $10,000 bronze casket, a casket that would be about $237,000 in 2025 value. By the way, papers back in the day called Barker's funeral, quote, the showiest gangster funeral Chicago has seen in the last 2 years. Members of the Northwest Side Toohey Gang were later credited with killing Barker. Here's one of the stranger grave-robbing stories of Chicago history, one that includes a celebrity angle. In 1957, 24-year-old Elizabeth Taylor, at the time one of the biggest movie stars in the world, married 47-year-old movie producer Michael Todd, the third marriage for both. Born in Minneapolis as Avron Hirsch Goldbogen and raised in Chicago, Todd was best known at the time of his marriage to Taylor for his Academy Award-winning 1956 production of Around the World in 80 Days. Todd had other connections to Chicago, including a movie theater called Michael Todd Theater on Dearborn, just south of Lake Street, and a theater cafe near Clark and Lawrence. On March 22, 1958, Todd, along with 3 other passengers, died in a plane crash in the Zuni Mountains near Grants, New Mexico, about 75 miles west of Albuquerque. Todd had named the plane Lucky Liz. Michael Todd's body was incinerated with only some bone fragments, scraps of clothing, a portion of the seatbelt, and, according to reports, his 10-carat wedding ring, which was returned to Liz Taylor. Side note, Todd's family purchased 6 family plots at Beth Aaron because at the time, Jewish funerals were not permitted in Chicago. Forest Park cemeteries are said to be among the first in the area that did not discriminate against Jews, hence the Goldbogen's decision for the location of their family gravesite. Fast forward to 19 years later, in June of 1977, an elderly woman visiting the cemetery noticed a toppled gravestone and an unearthed and empty casket, that of Michael Todd. Police were called to investigate the matter. Those responsible for this ghastly act first had to move the roughly 400-pound granite tombstone about 10 feet. They then had to dig a 4.5-foot deep hole to unearth the bronze coffin. They then pried open the coffin's lid, smashed a glass case, and grabbed the rubber bag containing Todd's remains. Police estimated the entire operation took at least 5 hours, and because of the weight of the heavy tombstone, would have required at least 2 to complete. A search of the cemetery later turned up only one clue, a shovel, likely used by the thieves. Through a spokesperson, Liz Taylor claimed to be very upset and as baffled as anyone over the motive. Police suspected vandalism or an anti-Semitic act, or maybe an attempt to extort money from Taylor, but no demands were made. With the help of a private detective, the rubber bag was found within a few days and reinterred. Although no one was ever charged with the crime, it is now widely assumed it was the work of mob types looking for the $100,000 wedding ring, although the casket contained nothing of material value. Speaking of mob types, let's talk about an unofficial cemetery, DuPage County's infamous gangster graveyard. DuPage County, located west of Chicago proper, is the home of Argonne National Laboratory. Back in 1988, acting on a tip, police searched an area not far from Argonne Labs near Route 83 and Bluff Road. For 5 months, police excavated the area, turning up 2 bodies not far from the former home of syndicate enforcer Joseph Jerry Scalise, who was in prison at the time for a London jewelry heist. The first body was unearthed on May 16, 1988, the second on June 9th. After 5 months, confident they had found all they would, police left the site. Nearly 19 years later, on March 20th, 2007, workers digging sewers for new townhomes near 91st Street made a grisly discovery when they unearthed the remains of reputed mobster Robert Charles Cruz of Killdeer, Illinois, who vanished December 4th, 1997. Cruz had been shot twice in the head, rolled up in a carpet, and buried about 8 feet deep, several blocks from the infamous gangster graveyard. Though Cruz had disappeared a decade earlier, DuPage coroner Pete Seichman said they were still able to identify him through his fingerprints. Cruz also had identifiable tattoos on both his arms. As it is with many mob killings in Chicago, none of these murders at DuPage County's infamous gangster graveyard have ever been solved. I do hope you enjoyed today's episode about Chicago's ghoulish past. As always, I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have a different topic you think might be a good fit for a future episode of the Chicago History Podcast. Feel free to reach out to me by email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I will be posting news articles, pictures, and maybe even some ads from back in the day related to this episode on the Chicago History Podcast social media pages. Check it out and give us a follow, please. Thanks as always to John K. Schneider for creating the Chicago History Podcast logo and the art used on the social media pages. He can be found via email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. Get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.